The flight that changed everything. It was supposed to be a quiet morning. Keanu Reeves and Alexandra Grant were boarding a flight to London for a private charity event. They had been traveling a lot lately, always together, always humble. They didn't travel in luxury jets like most celebrities. Keanu preferred commercial flights, sitting with regular passengers, greeting people with a simple smile. As they walked into the first-class cabin, Keanu carried both their bags. Alexandra, wearing a simple gray sweater and jeans, followed quietly. Around her neck, she wore a handmade silver necklace, small, elegant, but deeply meaningful. It wasn't expensive, but it held a story. It was a gift from her late mother, the only piece she never took off. As they settled into their seats, a flight attendant approached. She was young, elegant, and clearly recognized Keanu. She smiled brightly at him, ignoring Alexandra almost completely. "Mr. Reeves," she said cheerfully, "it's such an honor to have you on board. Can I get you anything before takeoff?" Keanu smiled politely. "Thank you, we're fine," he said, glancing toward Alexandra. But the attendant's eyes shifted briefly toward Alexandra's necklace, and her expression changed. She gave a small, mocking laugh. "Oh, that's interesting," she said, her tone sharp. "I wouldn't expect someone sitting next to Keanu Reeves to wear something so cheap." The words cut through the calm like a blade. Passengers nearby turned their heads. Alexandra froze, her hand instinctively touching the small silver pendant. Her face flushed, but she didn't respond. She had faced worse before. Judgment, whispers, headlines about her appearance, but hearing it said so openly, so cruelly, still hurt. Keanu looked up slowly. His voice stayed calm, but there was something different in his eyes. Quiet strength, the kind that makes people stop talking without shouting. "Is there something wrong with her necklace?" he asked softly. The attendant blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, no, sir, because," he continued, his tone steady. "It seems like a strange thing to comment on unless it made you feel something. Maybe you should ask yourself why." The cabin went silent. Even the air seemed to pause. Alexandra tried to speak, but Keanu gently touched her hand, a small gesture that said, "It's okay." The attendant stammered. "I didn't mean any disrespect. I just thought," Keanu interrupted softly, "you thought beauty is about price. But the truth is, beauty is about story. That necklace means more than anything money could buy." His words weren't loud, but they carried weight, the kind of weight that makes people think twice before speaking again. The attendant's face turned red. I'm sorry," she said quietly before walking away. Alexandra sat in silence, eyes down, trying to steady her breathing. Keanu turned toward her and smiled gently. "You don't have to explain it," he said. "The people who matter never need to." She nodded slowly, her fingers brushing the pendant once more. "It's just a necklace," she whispered. Keanu shook his head. "No, it's a memory, and memories are priceless." As the plane took off, Alexandra looked out the window. The clouds stretched endlessly below them, and for the first time that day, she smiled. "You didn't have to say anything," she murmured. Keanu's single quote's voice was soft, but firm. Sometimes silence lets the wrong thing win. He leaned back, closing his eyes, but she could still see the quiet fire behind them, the kind that protected without needing to fight. Yet neither of them knew that the moment wasn't over. What happened after that flight? One small act of kindness, one unexpected twist, would turn a private humiliation into a public story that inspired millions around the world. Asterisk the story that no one expected. The rest of the flight was quiet, but the silence between Keanu and Alexandra was full of unspoken emotion. Alexandra sat by the window, tracing tiny circles on the glass, her reflection looking softer and sadder than usual. Keanu watched her for a moment before speaking. "You know," he said gently, "you didn't deserve that." She gave a small smile. "I've heard worse. People always have opinions about what I wear, how I look. I used to care once. Now I just remind myself that kindness costs nothing." Keanu nodded slowly. "You've always had that strength," he said, "but sometimes the world mistakes quiet strength for weakness." She looked at him, her eyes tender. "You always see what others don't." He smiled faintly, but didn't reply. Instead, he reached for his bag, pulled out a small notepad, and began to write. Alexandra watched curiously. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Something I should have done long ago," he said quietly, still writing. A few hours later, the plane began its descent into London. Passengers unbuckled their belts, stretched, and reached for their bags. The same flight attendant returned to their row, her face pale and uncertain. She stood in front of them, hesitating, before finally saying, "Mr. Reeves, Ms. Grant, I want to apologize again. I shouldn't have said what I did earlier." Keanu looked up, his tone calm but kind. "Thank you for saying that," he said softly. "We all make mistakes. It's what we do after that shows who we really are." She nodded, looking relieved. Then Alexandra spoke for the first time since the incident. "People say things without realizing how deep words can go," she said gently. "But I forgive you." The attendant blinked, surprised. "You do?" Alexandra smiled. "Yes. I've learned that holding anger only hurts yourself. I hope next time you look for beauty before you judge it." For a moment, the woman said nothing. Then, with a shaky voice, she whispered, "Thank you. You're right." She walked away quickly, but everyone around them had heard. A man sitting behind them leaned forward. "That was beautiful," he said quietly. "You'd have handled that better than anyone I've ever seen." Keanu smiled politely, but Alexandra looked away. She didn't like being noticed for pain, yet when they walked off the plane, whispers followed them, not the cruel kind this time, but soft admiration. People had recorded the exchange on their phones, not realizing it would soon go far beyond that moment. At the airport, Keanu's assistant met them with a warm smile. "Welcome to London," she said cheerfully. "Ready for the event?" Keanu handed her the small notepad he'd been writing in. "Can you send this to the press office?" he asked. "It's something I want them to read before tomorrow's speech." Alexandra looked at him. "You wrote a speech?" He nodded slowly. "It's not really a speech. It's a reminder." She tilted her head, intrigued. "About what?" He smiled softly. "About how people measure worth." That night, Alexandra stood by the hotel window, looking down at the glowing streets of London. She thought about the flight attendant, the necklace, and Keanu's calm defense. For years, she had faced criticism, people calling her too simple, too different, too old to be with a man like him. And yet, in that small moment on the plane, she realized that the most powerful thing in the world wasn't beauty or fame, it was grace. The next morning, Keanu's words were everywhere. Reporters picked up the story from passengers who had witnessed the moment. Headlines spread, "KeanuReeves defends Alexandra Grant with powerful lesson on respect." But what truly shocked everyone came during the charity event that evening. When Keanu stepped onto the stage to speak, he wasn't just talking about the organization or the event. He was talking about that flight, that necklace, and what it meant to truly see people. His speech would soon go viral, touching millions across the world. And it all began because one person's cruelty met a heart strong enough to respond with compassion instead of anger. The speech that moved the world. Next evening, the hall in London was full. Chandeliers sparkled above hundreds of guests dressed in black and silver, gathered for the charity gala that supported our programs for underprivileged children. Cameras flashed as KeanuReeves and Alexandra Grant entered hand in hand. They looked calm, elegant, and completely unaware that what had happened on that flight was already making headlines around the world. The host introduced Keanu to the stage. He walked up slowly, dressed simply as always, no fancy tuxedo, no spotlight attitude, just calm humility. The audience clapped politely, expecting another short celebrity appearance. But the moment he began to speak, the room fell silent. "Yesterday," he said softly, "something small happened that reminded me how much we forget what real value means." His voice was quiet, but every word carried a certain gravity, like truth unfolding gently in the air. "Someone looked at a necklace," he continued, "and judged it for what it looked like, not for what it meant. But what they didn't know is that the necklace belonged to someone who wears it to remember her mother, a woman who taught her to see the world with kindness before beauty." The audience listened closely, some already realizing this wasn't just a story. Keanu glanced toward Alexandra, sitting in the front row, her eyes glistening. "That necklace," he said softly, "wasn't expensive. It wasn't meant to impress anyone. It was meant to remind her that love is the only thing worth carrying everywhere you go. And that reminder, that quiet truth, is what makes it more valuable than gold." You could hear the air shift in the room. People leaned forward, hanging on his every word. "We live in a world," he continued, "where people forget that worth doesn't shine, it glows. It doesn't shout, it whispers. Sometimes, the most beautiful things are the ones that ask for nothing in return." He paused, his gaze steady and kind. Yesterday, someone insulted something they didn't understand, but instead of anger, they were met with forgiveness. And that forgiveness changed the room. Because kindness has a sound. It's the silence that follows when the world suddenly remembers what being human feels like. The audience was still. Alexandra wiped a tear quietly. Keanu smiled faintly. We all carry things that matter to us. Maybe it's a ring, a photo, a letter, a memory. These things remind us of who we are, where we came from, and who we loved. Never let anyone make you feel small for what your heart values most. By the time he finished, there wasn't a single sound in the room. People didn't clap immediately. They were moved. Then slowly, applause began. It grew, filling the entire hall. Some people even stood, their eyes full of tears. Alexandra couldn't hold back anymore. She walked up to him on stage, her silver necklace catching the light. She didn't say anything. She just hugged him. The crowd erupted again, not for fame, not for spectacle, but for something rare, sincerity. By the next morning, videos of the speech were everywhere. Millions watched it online. News channels called it the most graceful response to hate ever seen. People wrote comments like, "This is why KeanuReeves is different. And this man just taught the world how to love without shouting." One woman commented, "I've been ashamed of the small things that remind me of my mom since she passed. Tonight, I took her old bracelet out again." Keanu read that comment quietly later that night. Alexandra sat beside him, sipping tea. She looked peaceful for the first time in days. "You didn't have to talk about it," she whispered. "But you turned something painful into something beautiful." He smiled softly. "The world doesn't change when we fight back," he said. "It changes when we forgive and still choose to stand tall." She nodded, eyes glistening again. "You know," she said, touching her necklace, "maybe my mother was right. Love always finds a way to be heard." Keanu looked at her, his eyes gentle. "Yes," he said quietly, "and sometimes it speaks through silence." They sat together in that calm, golden hour light, unaware that their small moment of grace had already begun to touch hearts across the world, and that one unexpected letter waiting for them the next morning would take the story even further. Asterisk the letter. That changed everything. Next morning, sunlight filtered softly through the curtains of their London hotel suite. Alexandra was still asleep, her hand resting near the small silver necklace that had started all of this. Keanu quietly stepped onto the balcony with a cup of tea, watching the city wake up. London felt different that day, calmer, warmer, almost peaceful after everything that had happened. His phone buzzed. Messages, emails, and news alerts filled the screen. The charity speech had gone viral overnight. Headlines everywhere read, "KeanuReeves defends Alexandra Grant with words that touch millions." Millions of comments poured in, people sharing their own stories of kindness, forgiveness, and moments when they chose peace over anger. But amid all the noise, one message stood out. It was an email from the airline. Keanu opened it slowly. It wasn't from a company executive or a press team. It was from the flight attendant. "Dear Reeves," the message began, "I don't expect you to reply, but I needed to write this. I'm the woman from the flight. I'm the one who said those words. I want you to know that what happened changed me. I watched your speech last night, and I cried the whole time. I realized that I've spent most of my life judging people by how they look, not who they are. I was wrong, completely wrong." Keanu kept reading, his eyes softening. "When you looked at me and asked me to think about why I said what I said, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The truth is, I've always felt invisible. I used to think being cruel would make me stronger, that putting others down meant I was worth more. But when you responded with kindness instead of anger, something broke inside me. I saw what real strength looks like." His chest tightened. He read on, "Please tell Alexandra that her forgiveness changed me. It made me want to be better. I've already apologized to my co-workers. I've decided to start therapy, and I'm volunteering at a local shelter next week. I don't know if I'll ever meet people like you again, but I'll never forget what you both taught me, that grace can rewrite a person's story." The letter ended with one simple line, "Thank you for showing me. That kindness doesn't make you weak. It makes you free." Keanu sat in silence, the message glowing on the screen. When Alexandra woke up and walked to the balcony, she saw the look on his face. "What is it?" she asked softly. He handed her the phone. She read the email quietly, tears welling up in her eyes. "She wrote this?" she whispered. He nodded. "Yes, she did. Alexandra's voice trembled. Keanu, you changed her life. He shook his head slowly. No, he said. We did. You did. With forgiveness. She smiled faintly, brushing away a tear. My mother always said kindness has a way of echoing. She was right. He said quietly. And maybe this is the echo. They spent the rest of that morning reading messages from strangers. A teacher wrote that she'd shared the story with her students to teach empathy. A soldier said he reconnected with his estranged sister after watching Keanu's speech. A young woman said she had been bullied for her appearance and found strength in Alexandra's calm. Dignity. Each story felt like another wave spreading outward from that single moment. On the plane, proof that something small, something painful, could become something deeply good. Later that afternoon, Alexandra placed her necklace on the table. You know, she said softly, for years, I thought this was just a memory. Now I think it's a reminder that love, even when hurt, can heal. Keanu smiled. Maybe that's what your mother meant it to be. She looked at him. Do you ever wonder why life gives us these tests? He nodded. To see if we can respond with love when it's hardest to. As the sun dipped below the London skyline, Alexandra leaned against him and whispered, Thank you for standing up for me. He smiled gently. You don't need anyone to stand up for you, Alexandra. You're already standing taller than most. But deep down, he knew something else. That the story wasn't just about them anymore. It had become a symbol of something bigger, the power of kindness in a world that often forgets it. And the next call they would receive, from someone they never expected, would take that message even further. The unexpected call. Days after the letter, Keanu and Alexandra were preparing to leave London. Their time there had turned into something much bigger than they imagined. Every major news outlet was talking about them. Every interview request was about the same moment of grace that started on that flight. But Keanu wasn't interested in attention. He never was. He cared about what the story represented, how something cruel had turned into something healing. As they sat in the airport lounge waiting for their flight home, Alexandra rested her head on his shoulder. I hope it fades soon, she whispered. Not because I don't appreciate it, but because I don't want people to think we did this for show. Keanu smiled softly. Truth doesn't need to shout, he said. The people who understand will keep it alive quietly. Just then, his phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't an unknown number. It was the airline's director of operations. Keanu hesitated, then answered. Reeves, the voice said respectfully. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I wanted to personally apologize for what happened on that flight. We've spoken with the attendant involved, and we've heard what she's doing now. She said your words changed her. To be honest, your kindness has changed a lot of people here. I'd like to ask something. Would you and Ms. Grant consider helping us with a campaign on empathy and respect for our staff and passengers? Keanu was quiet for a moment, surprised. A campaign? Yes, the man continued. We want to start something bigger, not about publicity, about kindness. We thought maybe your words could inspire others the way they inspired her. Keanu looked at Alexandra. She had heard enough of the call to understand. Her eyes softened, and she gave a small nod. He smiled faintly. We'll do it, he said. As long as it's about the message, not us. The man agreed instantly. That's exactly what we want, he said gratefully. Thank you, Mr. Reeves. Thank you for reminding the world what grace looked like. After hanging up, Keanu turned to Alexandra. You were right, he said quietly. Kindness does echo. Now it's going to reach even more people. She smiled. And it all started because of one thoughtless comment and one necklace, he added softly. They both laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was unbelievable how one small, hurtful moment could grow into something this meaningful. A few weeks later, they filmed a short video together. No fancy lights, no scripts, no glamour. Just the two of them sitting side by side. Keanu began. Sometimes, it's not what people say that matters. It's how you choose to respond. Alexandra continued, her voice calm and full of warmth. Every day, we meet people carrying invisible pain. Some hide it behind kindness, some behind cruelty. But every time you choose patience over anger, you give the world a chance to heal. The video ended with Keanu saying, kindness is free, but it's also the richest thing you can give. The campaign was released quietly. No dramatic headlines this time, no big launch. And yet, it spread like wildfire. Schools played it in classrooms. Airlines used it in training. People everywhere began sharing stories of small kindnesses, helping strangers, forgiving insults, standing up gently for what was right. Alexandra read hundreds of those comments one night, tears in her eyes. "Keanu," she said softly, "look at this one." A woman said she wore her grandmother's necklace to work for the first time in years because she was afraid people would judge her. And she said she didn't care anymore after hearing our story. He smiled. That's the real reward. But then Alexandra grew quiet. She looked down at her own necklace and whispered, "You know, it feels different now. It's not just my mother's anymore. It belongs to every woman who's ever been judged for being herself." Keanu reached for her hand. "And every man who's learning that love isn't about pride," he said softly. She nodded, smiling through her tears. As the weeks passed, their story continued to ripple quietly through the world. Kindness challenges began trending online. Schools made projects about empathy. Even strangers in airports greeted each other with warmer smiles. But there was one more twist waiting. One last act that would remind everyone that true kindness never stops. Where it starts. One evening, while walking through the airport where everything had begun, Keanu saw someone familiar, the flight attendant. She was standing by the boarding gate, helping an elderly passenger into a wheelchair. Her face looked different now, softer, humble, full of peace. When she saw him, her eyes widened in shock. "Mr. Reeves," she whispered, "you're here." He smiled kindly. "Looks like life brought us full circle." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for giving me a second chance." He shook his head gently. "You gave it to yourself." As he and Alexandra walked toward their gate, she whispered, "That was beautiful." Keanu smiled. "No," he said softly. "That was life, reminding us that forgiveness is the last chapter of every good story." Asterisk, the necklace that started a movement weeks turned into months. And yet the story of that flight, the speech, and the message of kindness refused to fade away. It had become something living, something that traveled further than either Keanu or Alexandra imagined. Everywhere they went, people approached them not to ask for photos or autographs, but to share stories of how they had chosen compassion over judgment because of them. One afternoon, Keanu and Alexandra were invited to a global conference on humanity and art. It wasn't a glamorous Hollywood event. It was something deeper, attended by teachers, artists, doctors, and young students who wanted to change the world in small but real ways. They had no idea that the organizers were planning something that would bring their journey full circle. As they arrived, Alexandra wore her silver necklace, the same one that had once been mocked. It caught the soft sunlight, glowing gently against her skin. When they stepped inside the hall, people rose to their feet in quiet respect. Banners on the walls read, "Kindness begins with seeing." The moderator smiled and said, "Today, we honor the people who reminded the world that strength isn't about pride. It's about grace." One simple moment on an airplane became a lesson for millions. Alexandra's eyes filled with emotion. She wasn't used to attention. She squeezed Keanu's hand under the table. He smiled back gently, as if to say, "This is your story." Then the moderator continued, "We also have someone here who wanted to say something personally." The audience turned, and there she was, the flight attendant. She stepped forward nervously, holding a small box in her hands. Alexandra gasped softly. She hadn't expected to see her again. The woman's eyes shimmered as she spoke into the microphone. "When I first met Ms. Grant," she said softly, "I saw someone I didn't understand. I judged her unfairly because I thought beauty was something you could measure. I was wrong. That day changed my life. Your forgiveness gave me a reason to change, and I want to thank you, not with words, but with something I made." She opened the box. Inside was a delicate silver pendant, the small hands forming a circle around a heart, made from recycled metal collected from old airplanes. Alexandra covered her mouth, tears falling silently. "I made this as a reminder," the woman continued, "that sometimes the ugliest moments can become the most beautiful when we choose love over pride." The audience stood again, applauding softly, not out of pity but out of deep respect. Alexandra walked toward the woman and hugged her tightly. "You didn't just make jewelry," she whispered. "You made peace." When she returned to her seat, Keanu looked at her with quiet admiration. "That necklace," he said gently, "started everything. And now it's changed the person who once mocked it. That's the real miracle." She smiled through her tears. "It was never about the necklace," she said softly. "It was about remembering that love doesn't have to defend itself. It just has to stay kind." Keanu nodded, his voice warm. And you've done that better than anyone I know. Later that evening, as the event ended, they stood outside under the fading light. Alexandra held both necklaces in her hands, the one from her mother and the one gifted that day. She looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you." Keanu wrapped his arm around her. "You think your mother sees this?" "I think she always did," Alexandra said. "She believed that kindness finds its way back, even through strangers." Keanu smiled. Then she was right, because one act of forgiveness just started a movement. The next morning, newspapers around the world shared the story again, but this time, the headline was different. It didn't talk about humiliation or fame or scandal. It simply read, "How one woman's kindness changed the world," and the man who stood beside her. Underneath was a photo, Alexandra smiling with tears in her eyes, wearing both necklaces. Keanu beside her, calm and grounded, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. In interviews afterward, Keanu said the same simple line that became his signature, "You don't need to shine to be seen. Sometimes all it takes to change the world is one quiet act of kindness." That quote spread everywhere, printed on posters, shared on social media, painted on classroom walls. And soon, schools began something new called the Necklace Challenge, where students were encouraged to share the story and perform one silent act of kindness for someone they didn't know. Years later, that story would still be remembered, not as a celebrity moment, but as a reminder of what humanity can be when pride steps aside and love leads. And somewhere, on a quiet morning flight, someone looked at another person's simple necklace, smiled softly, and said nothing, because kindness had already taught them to see differently.